Hello, learners, and welcome to the 52nd lecture in the NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. We have been discussing the life and work of Sylvia Plath. I have provided the biographical overview, and I have discussed how and why the publication of Ariel in 1965 was such a fraught event. The reason it was a fraught event was because of the relationship that Sylvia Plath had with Ted Hughes and the executorship of over Plath's papers that Hughes came to possess. I will briefly read a poem titled The Rabbit Catcher, in which we will see how Ted Hughes responds in some ways to the controversy surrounding Plath's life, as well as a poem that Plath had wrote, also titled The Rabbit Catcher, which I read in the previous lecture. And to very briefly recall Plath's poem, The Rabbit Catcher, the poem described an event, something like a picnic, where the poet, presumably an earlier version of Sylvia Plath herself, while walking around a windy, somewhat sparse English countryside, happened to see metal snares, traps designed to catch rabbits, and is struck by the observation of these traps into a reflection of on her life. And the rabbit catcher, a metallic snare, a very violent piece of instrument, reminds Sylvia Plath, reminds the speaker of Plath's poem in any case, of her marriage and her relationship with another person. Now, that is what we get from the poem titled The Rabbit Catcher by Sylvia Plath. Ted Hughes, incidentally, or not so incidentally, also wrote a poem with the same title, and this was published much later, almost a decade after Plath's poem. Some facts are worth noting. Hughes's poem is a response, obviously because he uses the same title. But what kind of a response is it? That part is less clear or less obvious. In some sense, it is clear that Hughes saw his poem as a reflection on his relationship with Plath. In a poem titled Fever, Hughes refers to, quote, the stone man, unquote, and the burning woman, also in quotes. And Birthday Letters, the title of that volume, the volume in which The Rabbit Catcher was published, was very obviously an attempt to address some questions. It was an attempt, and a successful one, to intervene in a public debate into which Hughes had been dragged, whether he liked it or not. And mostly he did not like it. Hughes did not like that the entire English-speaking world, to some extent, the literary world, anyone who cared for the people who wrote English poems, seemed to have an opinion on his marriage, his erstwhile marriage with Plath, and seemed to have an opinion on what exactly was the role played by people, and especially by him, Ted Hughes, in the way that marriage and Plath's life ended. So this was a debate, and despite not making any public statements, and in fact, the only public statement before this poem was one in which Hughes has said, and I quoted in the previous lecture, that there are quite a few more important things in the world than producing or than giving the world good poems. And a statement that clearly demonstrates for Hughes the priority that he gave to the shared life that he had with Plath, and how this was much more important, the life he had with Plath, their conjugal, communal, intimate life. That was more important than poems. And the specific order in which Plath's Ariel collection might have been published. Hughes made no response, no public statement, but then he published a book of poems in which one happens to have the same title as a poem by Plath. So obviously, this is an attempt by Hughes to send a message. And the message was that Hughes would take an opportunity to finally tell his side of the story, or at least his perspective. This was also the final collection. Hughes died of cancer months after this book appeared. So, in a way, it became his final word, if not the final word. It became the final word by anyone who was involved in this very turbulent relationship, this turbulent chapter in the lives of two human beings, which produced some of the most powerful poems in the English language. Other people would continue to have opinions. In fact, by one estimate, there are more than 1,000 book-length monographs that have been published on Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. So this is clearly an unending topic, a topic with endless curiosity and interest for literary scholars. So it is not the final word, Hughes's collection, but it is the final word by anyone directly involved in that relationship. So it is possible that Hughes's poem was either trying to fix the record from his interests, or he was trying to give the conversation a new direction and thereby a new beginning. Some clues to what Hughes might have been doing can be had from an interview that Hughes gave to Janet Malcolm, in which Hughes said, "The only thing I found hard to understand was the sudden discovery of our bad moments, and how these bad moments became subjects for poems." Whether or not this was an accurate assumption, it gives us a hint as to how we can read the poem. The speaker in Hughes's poem, The Rabbit Catcher, offers an alternative view of the scene from Plath's poem. So Plath's poem reflects on an encounter, an event, and Hughes's poem reflects on the same encounter, the same experience, but gives a very different interpretation of it. Hughes's poem is so different from Plath's in narrative, in mode, and in tone that it does not really function as a reply. The poem's speaker has an almost self-consciously bewildered male persona, describing a female partner's inaccessible anger as a moon-directed menstrual and mythical Dybbuk fury. The speaker of Hughes's poem is not only detached, but also excluded from what he can observe and he can infer as a very exclusively female drama. There's a sentence in this poem which demonstrates how, for the speaker, his partner, his wife, is locked in this very exclusive female drama, and his role is simply, as the speaker puts it in Hughes's poem, "I simply trod accompaniment, carried babies." So we will see to what extent Hughes's interpretation is accurate, to what extent it is just or ethical and judicious, and to what extent it has an element of vengefulness. This is the Rabbit Catcher by Ted Hughes. It was May. How had it started? What had bared our edges? What quirky twist of the moon's blade had set us so early in the day, bleeding each other? What had I done? I had somehow misunderstood. Inaccessible in your Dybbuk fury, babies hurled into the car you drove. We surely had been intending a day's outing somewhere on the coast, an exploration, so you started driving. So this poem, The Rabbit Catcher, begins with a very clear setting of the scene. The speaker establishes the context in very straightforward terms. The speaker is speaking to us in a conversational style. The speaker is remembering an outing. The speaker is remembering a day when, for some unknown reason, his partner and himself were not on very good terms. He wonders what it was that he might have done to produce this very difficult situation. He uses some powerful expressions. He says, the moon's blade had set us bleeding each other, right? So the moon's blade, something about the moon has empowered these two individuals to hurt each other. He's referring to, of course, some kind of a mythic idea of the changing spheres of the sky, the movement of the sun and the moon affecting the hormones, affecting the moods, affecting the physiology of human beings. He's referring also to a pre-modern medical science in which it was understood that the menstrual cycle of women and the behavior of women was affected by the movement of the moon. And indeed, in this very poem, he says that uh, everyone else was following in the wake of the woman's fury. Babies were hurled into the car, the woman drove, and everyone else follows. That's what we learn in this first stanza. The poem continues. The second stanza begins. What I remember is thinking, she'll do something crazy. And I ripped the door open and jumped in beside you. So we drove west. Cornish lanes, I remember, a simmering truce as you stared, with iron in your face, into some remote thunderscape of some unworldly war. I simply trod accompaniment, carried babies, waited for you to come back to nature. We tried to find the coast. You raged against our English private greed of fencing off all coastal approaches, hiding the sea from roads, from all inland. So we learn more about what's happening. And the speaker constantly shifts to the present tense, reminds us of what exactly is happening. What is happening is a man is remembering an event, but because he's old and because this event occurred many years ago, his memory is weak. He cannot remember the details exactly. So he emphasizes very clearly that what he's writing about, what we are reading, the narrative we are getting, the events that we are threading together, the plot that we are building, that is a figment of a person's effort to remember. It is not the truth. It cannot be the fact. It is very basically, and the very basics of it are under question because it is a man remembering something that happened a long time ago. Before we even get to how he interprets the event, we cannot even be sure what exactly he's remembering, whether what he's remembering, whether the facts that he's remembering are accurate. So with that disclaimer, the scene is described in great detail. The woman drives, the man wonders that what she will do because she's clearly angry or upset about something. They keep driving west. While she drives, the man minds the babies and tries to ensure that everything is okay. And he's waiting, anxiously waiting and hoping that the woman comes back to a normal, a functional mood. And then they try to find the coast. They're clearly looking for the beach. And then he remembers how the woman made some comments about the history and the geography and the culture of England. What did she say? Sylvia Plath raged against our English private greed, fencing off coastal approaches, hiding the sea from roads, from all inland. So this is an American's critique of the British sense of hierarchy, the hard set rules of class, the entitlement that people in England, people from a certain class, feel toward isolating and demarcating places based on class. So because land was privatized, people in England who owned the land did not want trespassers, did not want outsiders or commoners to use those roads or use those areas. And that is why while Hughes and Plath are driving along the British coast looking for the beach, they're having trouble finding a road which would go to the beach. This is because all the owners of these lands, private landowners, have fenced off the common roads. And then further, you despised England's grubby edges when you got there. So they finally get to the beach or wherever they're trying to, a place close to the sea. Before they get there, Hughes gets several earfuls from Plath about corrupt, greedy, private, elite, and class driven mentality and culture of England. And then further, the day belonged to the Furies. I searched the map to penetrate the farms and private kingdoms. Finally, a gateway. It was a fresh day, full May. Somewhere I'd brought food. We crossed a field and came to the open, blue push of sea wind, a gorse cliff, brambly, oak-packed combs. We found an eyrie hollow just under the cliff top. It seemed perfect to me. Feeding babies, your Germanic scowl, edged like a helmet, would not translate itself. I sat baffled. So they found a place. They found a place that's close to the sea. There's a full blast of sea wind. It's on a cliff, but there's also a protected stony cave. So they found a spot that's perfect for a picnic. It's a summer's day in May. The weather is very pleasant. They can be outside. So despite finding this perfect spot for a picnic, to sit, to rest, to eat, to enjoy the weather, Hughes notes that something was still eating away at his partner, at his female partner. Even though it seemed perfect to me, that is, after all the struggle, they found a spot to relax. It seemed perfect, but it was not perfect. It was far from perfect for his partner, Sylvia Plath. And we are described exactly how Hughes concludes this. Even while she was feeding their babies, her Germanic scowl, edged like a helmet, would not translate itself. So she sits there stewing in her own fury, stewing in this anger and something that has upset her, something which the poet is trying to figure out from the very beginning of the day, attributing it to the moon's blade, right? Germanic refers to Plath's paternal ancestry. Otto Plath was a German immigrant, was born in Germany in 1885. And the German inheritance is something that we will discuss later when we read Plath's poems about her father. But this is Hughes using the Germanic reference or using Plath's paternal ancestry from Germany to connect this poem and the mood in which Plath was that day with the poem with which Plath remembers and writes about her own father, the elegies that we will discuss a little bit later. So the word Germanic in this line intensifies the madness, the impenetrable anger that Hughes finds himself confronted with. Hughes writes, I sat baffled. I was a fly outside on the window pane of my own domestic drama. You refused to lie there being indolent. You hated it. That flat, drafty plate was not an ocean. You had to be away and you went. And I trailed after like a dog, along the cliff-top field edge, over a wind-matted oak wood. And I found a snare. So this is the walk. This is the walk that Plath was describing in her poem, the walk on which she had found herself alone and in which she felt the wind blast and she caught sight of a snare, the trap designed to catch rabbits. We reach that same moment in this poem when Hughes is following behind her like a dog, he says, because she went away. She wanted to be by herself. She wanted to be away from these people, the kind of draining energies that Hughes was overwhelming her with. There, Hughes also observed the same snare, and this is how Hughes writes about it. And I found a snare, copper white gleam, brown cord, human contrivance, sitting new set. Without a word, you tore it up and threw it into the trees. I was aghast. Faithful to my country gods, I saw the sanctity of a trapline desecrated. You saw blunt fingers, blood in the cuticles, clamped around a blue mug. I saw country poverty raising a penny, filling a Sunday stew pot. You saw baby-eyed strangled innocence. I saw sacred ancient custom. You saw snare after snare and went ahead, riving them from their roots and flinging them down the wood. I saw you ripping up precarious, precious saplings of my heritage, hard-won concessions from the hangings and transportations to live off the land. You cried, murderous. You were weeping with a rage that cared nothing for rabbits. You were locked into some chamber, grasping for oxygen, where I could not find you or really hear you, let alone understand you. So a long stanza describing one particularly strong reaction to these traps, and describing a very different reaction to the same snare. This is a difference between, obviously, between two individuals and how they view the same catch, the same snares. Sylvia Plath, born in Massachusetts, on a fellowship, arrived in England at Cambridge University, meets Ted Hughes, makes a life in England and in London. This is the immigrant, the American who has crossed the pond. The American Sylvia Plath's reaction to these snares reminds her of violence, gratuitous, unnecessary cruelty. And the same sight reminds the British Ted Hughes, who was born in Mythill Merod, Yorkshire, and who grew up with close observations, close proximity with British nature, with British countryside, and the wildness and the animals, both domesticated and wild, that were present in that British landscape, and who made a career out of writing poems about what makes wild nature truly wild. Ted Hughes has a very different reaction to these rabbit-catching snares. The difference is cultural. For Plath, the snare only reminds her of cruelty. For Hughes, it reminds him of poor people trying to make a living, country poverty raising a penny, filling a Sunday stew pot, people who cannot afford to buy meat, depend on a few rabbits falling into their snares. Plath sees baby-eyed, strangled innocence. Hughes sees sacred ancient custom. So at some point, Hughes says that you as in he means Sylvia, that Plath was struck by the violence and the cruelty and was weeping with a rage that cared nothing for rabbits. Hughes's point is that rabbits, the cruelty, the rabbit catcher, all of these reflections are an excuse for what truly bothers Plath, which is something else. He cannot know what it is that bothers her, but he seems to be confident that whatever it is that bothers her is not the fact that some rabbit is going to be caught in the snare and die. She is fighting some demons in her own private space, and he has no idea what those demons are, but he expects to be spared the cruelty and the violence because he has nothing to do with those demons. That is the perspective in this stanza. And he also absolves himself of the guilt of not understanding her or not being more sympathetic to her. Because he says that she was locked in an iron chamber, gasping for oxygen, and she would not let him in. That is the verdict that Hughes pronounces in this stanza. Further, in those snares you'd caught something. Had you caught something in me, nocturnal and unknown to me? Or was it your doomed self, your tortured, crying, suffocating self? Whichever, those terrible hypersensitive fingers of your verse closed around it and felt it alive. The poems, like smoking entrails, came soft into your hands. A very powerful stanza that concludes this poem. The metaphors, the images, all come together. The metaphor of the snare or a metallic trap closing around a live animal. The poet, in this case Plath, the poet who writes a poem titled The Rabbit Catcher, becomes a trap herself, becomes a metallic trap. And the rabbit in this case is Hughes. The rabbit in this case is what their relationship had become. And Hughes likens Plath's poem to a trap that has got their relationship, that has got their marriage, which is an innocent rabbit caught in a trap. Further, the metaphor is developed and modified slightly, and Hughes further argues that the poems themselves are like the smoking entrails. So the entrails here refers to poor people, country poverty, Hughes refers to them earlier. Poor people who, at the end of the day, will go and check these snares and see what animal has been caught in them. And then they will cut up that animal and cook that animal to eat it. And the smoking entrails, because they are poor, they will not throw away the entrails, but they will find a way to make those edible as well. They'll probably roast them on a spit. And that's what the smoking entrail here is. The poems here for Hughes, Plath's poems about their marriage, and of which The Rabbit Catcher is a very prime example, are like those smoking entrails, and they came soft into her hands. So this is how Hughes ends this poem, very clearly an interpretation and a response to Plath's own reflection on the rabbit catcher. And the scholar Stu Weiss has a very damning indictment of Hughes based on this poem. Weiss calls this poem by Hughes clever and vengeful for the way it turns around and blames Plath for killing things. Hughes blames Plath for destroying something beautiful with her neurosis, her irrational anger, and her supposed madness. Ignoring, and this is what I would add to Weiss's interpretation, if we can see Hughes' poem, The Rabbit Catcher, as an attempt to give the final word on their relationship, as an attempt to set the record straight by offering the material contexts in which the poetic effort began and which culminated in Plath's poem, The Rabbit Catcher, and which Hughes excluded from Ariel, then Hughes' own poem, we can see, very conveniently ignores many things. It ignores all the ways in which it was Hughes himself and his own actions that had driven her to such madness in the very first place. In the opening line of Hughes' poem, Hughes refers to what had I done. And in fact, that is the answer. It was his inability to see in his own actions the cause and the source of the kind of bleeding that he describes, bleeding by which he means the hurts that these two people caused each other. Now, I will take a pause from focusing on these two individuals, Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath. I think I have provided a clear enough overview and background to the relationship between these two individuals and how it produced different kinds of writing. I will take a different approach now and establish the tradition of the American family elegy. This was a special category of poems, and it was first written by a small group of poets who, through their work, established a unique and powerful style of writing. The American family elegy was marked by a few unique features. Chief among these features was a particular kind of violence or anger that was directed at a particular family member, someone who was very close to the poet. And this kind of writing needs to be situated in a history. So, popular American writing and poetry in the early 20th century was marked with a skepticism towards the elegy as a form. There are several examples of this kind of skepticism, and chief among these are two that I've selected. That is Benjamin Franklin's poem about how to make an excellent elegy, in which Franklin argued that one needed only to mix a few ingredients, which were the dead person's virtues and excellencies, that was the first. Second, his last words, dying expressions and such. Finally, a handful or two of melancholy expressions. These expressions, Franklin argued, should then be put into the empty skull of some young Harvard, and then it has to be allowed to ferment, leading to a perfect elegy. So, this skepticism is seconded by several other writers, and across the century, as the century moves forward, the skepticism will grow, and American poets and writers will display increasingly confrontational attitudes towards the subject of their elegies, that is, people, their family members who've just passed away. I will discuss this tradition and also focus in greater detail on poems by Sylvia Plath in the next lecture. Thank you.